For many years, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has said it helps countries by giving them loans when they are in financial trouble. But instead of making countries stronger and wealthier, many believe that the IMF traps them in debt, making life harder for ordinary people. So, is the IMF really helping, or is it part of a bigger plan to keep some countries poor? Let's go back in time and uncover the full story. How the IMF was created. After World War II, Europe was in ruins. Many cities were destroyed, and food and fuel were running out. Things got so bad that in Germany, people started using cigarettes as money because their currency was worthless. World leaders were afraid that if they didn't fix the economy quickly, there would be another war. So, in 1944, 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA, to create a system that would rebuild Europe and keep global trade stable. From this meeting, two major financial organizations were created. The World Bank, its job was to give long-term loans to help countries build roads, schools, and hospitals. The IMF, its job was to make sure the global economy stayed stable and that countries didn't fall into chaos. At first, these organizations were meant to help Europe recover from war. But over time, they started lending money to poor countries, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Africa had no say in the IMF's rules. Out of the 44 countries that created the IMF and the World Bank, guess how many were African? 0. At that time, most African countries were still under European colonial rule and had no voice in the decisions being made. This meant that all the rules were written to benefit Western countries, while Africa was left out. By the time African nations gained independence, they found themselves trapped in a global system that was never designed to help them. How the IMF keeps Africa poor. Many African countries needed money to develop their economies, so they went to the IMF and the World Bank for loans. But these loans came with harsh conditions known as structural adjustment programs, SAPs. To get a loan, African countries were forced to follow strict rules, including cut government spending, meaning less money for schools, hospitals, and public services. Sell government-owned businesses, foreign companies bought them cheaply and took control. Remove subsidies of food, fuel, and farming prices skyrocketed, making life harder for ordinary people. Open markets to foreign investors, this allowed Western companies to buy African resources at low prices. On paper, these policies were supposed to help African economies grow. But in reality, they made things worse. The IMF's impact on Africa. Instead of helping countries escape poverty, the IMF's loans pushed many African nations into deeper debt. Here's what happened. Schools and hospitals lost funding and had to shut down. Farming became more expensive because subsidies were removed. Millions of people lost jobs as industries were sold to foreign investors. Debt grew bigger because countries had to borrow more money just to survive. Meanwhile, big corporations from the West made huge profits by buying African businesses and resources at low prices. Even today, many African countries are still paying off debts from loans they took decades ago. Why do people call the IMF a scam? At a recent meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco, world leaders and financial experts exposed the truth about the IMF. They said the IMF acts more like a global debt collector than an economic helper. Instead of helping countries grow, it makes sure that rich creditors get paid fast while poor people suffer. For many, this is not a broken system, this is exactly how it was designed to work. And that's why some African leaders are now rejecting the IMF and its loans. African leaders who are saying no to the IMF. In recent years, some African countries have decided to break free from the IMF's control. One of the loudest voices against the IMF is Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré. He believes that Africa must control its own resources instead of selling them to foreign countries. Loans from the West keep Africa poor and dependent. African nations should build their own financial system without the IMF and World Bank. Other leaders, like Mali's Assimi Goïta and Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya, also believe that Africa must be free from Western financial control. They are choosing to work with new partners like China and Russia instead of taking loans from the IMF. What happens when countries reject the IMF? History has shown that when leaders stand up to the IMF, they face serious consequences. Here are some examples. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi wanted to create a gold-backed African currency to replace the US dollar. In 2011, he was overthrown and killed. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe refused to follow IMF policies. The US and Europe placed harsh sanctions on Zimbabwe, damaging its economy. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso was a strong leader who rejected Western loans. In 1987, he was assassinated, and many believe foreign powers were involved. So, will leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and Assimi Goïta face the same challenges for rejecting the IMF? Why Africa still pays the price? Even after decades of IMF loans, many African countries are still trapped in cycles of debt. For example, Ghana is spending 40% of its national budget just to repay debt. Zambia became the first African country to default on its IMF loan in 2020. Kenya and Nigeria are struggling with rising food and fuel prices due to IMF policies. If the IMF system was really meant to help Africa, why are so many countries worse off than before? The future of Africa without the IMF. More and more African nations are now questioning whether they need the IMF at all. Some experts believe that more African leaders will reject Western loans. New financial institutions, like BRICS, will become more popular. Africa will begin trading with its own currency instead of using the US dollar. But one thing is clear: Africa's future should be decided by Africans, not foreign banks and institutions. Final thoughts. The IMF was created to help countries stabilize their economies, but for Africa, it has caused debt that never goes away. Weaker economies controlled by foreign companies. Harsh policies that make life harder for ordinary people. That's why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Mamadi Doumbouya are rejecting IMF loans and building a new path for Africa. The big question is, should Africa continue working with the IMF, or is it time to break free? What do you think? Is the IMF really helping Africa, or is it keeping the continent poor? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more discussions on Africa's future.